Welcome, every one of you who is attending our session today. You are attending the Intacct General Ledger Transaction Approvals. My name and host today is David Caldwell. I'm accompanied by Mr. Wes Salisbury, who is involved with the Intacct consulting team here at Costerisan. This is the first in a series of 3 discussions, webinars. Today, again, we're talking about General Ledger Transaction Approvers. We're going to move on to in our next series, number 2, to talking about accounts payable, check selection approval process, and then finally we'll be moving into our 3rd series, which has to do with the purchase order series and talking about setting up the approval system in that area and how that works. I will say this, out of all 3 areas of Intacct having to do with the approval mechanism, the purchase order process module is one of the more complex, but yet has an awful lot of depth in terms of capability and giving you some flexibility in terms of how those approvals are going to work. And the beauty of that is, just to kind of give you a little bit of insight ahead of time here, is that the purchase order system does not necessarily mean that you have to use the purchase order system for purchase ordering process. We can certainly start with entering in invoices directly into the purchase order system, allowing us to use some of the capabilities that the purchase order system allows us to use inside of approvals. So we'll talk more about that. So we're going to get started here, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of an overview of what we're going to be covering. I think one of the keys to setting up the approval system within the Intacct system is making sure that the areas that need to be configured are configured appropriately. Leaving out one of the areas could mean that you may not be successful in getting the approval system to work to your expectations. So the configuration, although it is not difficult, but is something that you want to make sure that you cover adequately and give good consideration to, so that at least the outcome that you expect will be delivered by the Intacct system. So we're going to talk a lot about that, from the users to the submitter to just the overall general ledger setup in terms of how those controls will allow this system to work in the manner that you would want it to work in. So we're going to walk through that, and I also want to do a demonstration of how the approval process works. Once it's set up, how does it manifest itself? What does it look like? What is it that you can expect out of the system as you're using it? So I want to cover those as well and show you how that works. So the first thing that I want to really walk through with you is the steps to setting up the approval. I am going to be working from this document, but I will be flipping back and forth to looking at the Intacct system. So let me go through some points here with you having to do with users that you do need to keep in mind. So we're going to start off with that, because that is probably one of the most important pieces of this system, is making sure that you have the appropriate users referenced that are going to be participating within the approval process. So first of all, in order for this part of the system to work, the general ledger and being able to process general ledger transactions or to either approve general ledger transaction, it is required that the individuals are business users. So in other words, they cannot be employee users. They have to be business users. So that is one of the things that you need to segregate out. The second thing is having to do with user preferences. So inside of user preferences also denote as to whether or not a certain individual is going to get an email and whether or not that individual can act as an approver within the system. Third is that the user or the role security has to be given adequate permissions, not only if they are a person who's going to be entering in general ledger transactions, has the permissions to enter those transactions, but if you are an approver, that you have permissions to being able to approve. So very, very important to making sure that those permissions are set appropriately to the individuals, whether or not you're a submitter, that is a person who's entering in the general ledger transactions, or a person who's going to be an approver. Those permissions have to be set appropriately. The next thing is that, as you well know, when you set up a user inside of Intacct, there are certain requirements that have to be met. And one is setting up a contact for each one of the users, but more importantly, and surrounded around what we're talking about today, is to having an appropriate email address. So emails can work in both directions, and that is that once the submitter or the user puts in a GL transaction, the person who or persons who have been identified as approvers have to at least be notified, or should be notified, that there is a waiting approval for them. Without that, they would have to go into the system in a normal fashion and work themselves to an area called approved transactions to find out whether or not there's any transactions there waiting for an approval. But the email certainly facilitates that process, because it does bury a link in the email to that approver for them to follow that will take them through the login process and then directly into the section that will allow them to go through the process of approving transactions that are awaiting them. Now, from a submitter or person who is entering in the general ledger transactions, that person should be notified that an approval has been made, so that the transaction then can go through its second step and be posted into the general ledger transaction tables and impact the overall balances within the chart of accounts. So the email address is very, very important within the system, especially for those who are going to be participating in some fashion or another as far as approvals are concerned. So I'm going to sidestep here for just a moment. We're going to go out to the Intacct area, and we're going to take a look at those areas so at least we can identify them. So let's go on out to Intacct. We're going to be working within a system that I have as a demonstration system called Qubit. The first area that I want to focus at here is our users. And there are a couple of users that we're going to be focusing our attention today on, is Carla Grace and Jacob Coleman. The first thing is that since these two are going to be involved in one, either entering in transaction, which is actually Jacob's job, and Carla, being more of a managerial type, will be the person who will be approving transactions that Jacob, in our example today, that will be entering. So the first thing, let's look at the first point, is that the type of user that's allowed here. Again, this is Carla's setup. She is noted as a business user as opposed to an employee user, which is one of the important things that we have here identified as far as Carla's concerned to being able to approve. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that she has to have admin privileges. However, if Carla's also the person who is involved with setting up and identifying approvers in the system and possibly venturing into the configuration part of General Ledger to complete the overall setup, she will at least need to have some kind of admin privileges to being able to do that. We are working off of role-based security as opposed to individual security in this part of the system. Regardless of whether or not you are using roles or whether or not individuals, the permissions in terms of how they're presented to you will be the same. So for those of you who are using roles, I think you can identify that. For those of you who are using individual permissions, which is permitted in this system, and to utilize the approval, the permission setup is identical regardless of whether or not it's role or user. Carla's controller here, so I want to keep that in mind. The next thing is I want to go out and I want to look at user preferences, which can be managed here, and we're going to go over to preferences and look at Carla's preferences. And an area that we have is called request for approvals. Okay? And in this case, we've identified Carla as having requests sent to her for journal entry approvals. So the two areas that you see out here alongside of that is payment request, which is alongside of the accounts payable approval process, which we're going to be covering in our second series, and then the purchasing, which covers the purchase order module. So right now, Carla is just only able to approve journal entries in this case, or at least this is part and parcel of what we need to set up here. All right, the other thing down here is a couple of radio buttons that allow us to define how many emails come out to Carla in this case when there are a series of transactions entered in at the general ledger level. she could get, for every journal entry that needs approval, an individual email. Or, and this might be a better choice, is to have them consolidated. So if there's a series of general ledgers transactions that Jacob in this case might enter, Carla, upon choosing consolidated here, would get one email that would notify her of that session of transactions that were entered in. So as far as cluttering is concerned, this might be a better choice. I would encourage you to experiment around with that as you're going through and using the accounts, the general ledger approval system here. So these are a couple of things that we just need to make sure of, especially when it comes to the approval side of things. Okay. And the next thing that I want to look at are the permissions. And since this is role-based security, we're going to go out to roles and we're going to look at Carla's subscriptions or permissions here. And particularly as it has to do with general ledger, we're going to go into permissions, and you can see that she has several types of permissions within the approval portion of the general ledger, but the one key thing is that she can approve journal entries, and this at least needs to be marked for her to being able to at least participate in the approval process. So again, this is another step. It sometimes is missed as one is going through and setting up the approval system. The other thing to consider is this area up here where it says journal entries. Perhaps we would like for Carla to being able to not only list those journal entries in the normal list view section, view them, and possibly go ahead and add journal entries herself, edit and delete, and possibly reverse. So this might be an appropriate measure for her to have as well. Okay? Now, in contrast to that, I'm going to show you Jacob's permissions here in this case under the general ledger, because he is identified as our person who will be entering in journal entries. In this case, he has very limited access throughout the general ledger system. You can see that as the checkboxes are not as prominent as what they were for Carla, but we do have him having the ability to list, view, add, edit, and delete, and in this case, in the sample data, he's not allowed to reverse if that's an option within the system. The other thing is that he cannot approve entries. Okay? Now, one of the questions that will come up often is that since Carla is going to be identified as an approver, could she approve her own entries? And the answer to that question is that she could. She could approve her own entries and perhaps bypass the whole approval system, or it could mean that even though that Carla is a person who not only is an approver, but also we're going to allow her to enter in journal entries, that we would like to have an alternate approval for her in particular, so at least there is some segregation of responsibility and segregation of approval, and we will take care of that kind of thing inside of the general ledger setup. So I wanted to cover those areas having to do with the business type. Let's go back to our document here. So we talked about the approver. We also talked about the submitter and the types of things that we need to consider in terms of setting up that user, that type of user, in case this is Jacob here who's going to be entering in general ledger transactions, and their security and permissions. Okay? Now, the second major piece here is the general ledger setup, and that is that you have to have administrative permissions to access the setup option within general ledger. And then the other attention piece here is talking about the approval options that we're confronted with. So let's look at those real quick before we actually look at the general ledger setup screen, and I want to go through these with you. And I have highlighted some areas here that are important for us to consider. Pardon me if I read exact a word here, but I think they're important here. I'll try to elaborate a little more if necessary. So considerations having to do with approvals. Approval journal entries. A user needs to be an admin or a business user and approve journal entry permission in the general ledger application. We saw that. We talked about that a little earlier. In a multi-entity environment, some of you are in a multi-entity environment, others may not be. require approval of journal transactions entered at the top level entity level or both. Okay? And going on to say here is that top level transactions require an approval for journal transactions entered at the top level. So we have to enable the journal entry approval, assign the approvers at the top level. Journal entry approval that you set up at the entity level will be ignored. Going on, if you want approval at the entity level, we may enable the journal entry approver, assign the approvers at the entity level. If you don't, Intacct will check if there is an enablement and approver assigned at the top level. If you enable and assign at both levels, then they use the entity level assignments. So you want to keep that in mind here in terms of what part of Intacct, whether or not it's top level or whether or not it's entity level, in terms of how you view and where you want approvers to, the approval process to be designated. You have to make sure that you understand whether or not you are top level entry or whether or not you are entity level entry. At entity level entry, you may define different approvers across multiple entities. Okay? At the top level, it is not as specific, or it could get specific, but it is prevailing across all entities at that point. So you want to keep that in mind in terms of, you know, who has governance over the other. All right, let's go on down here. Enable journal entry approvals. Okay? So we're going to see that section inside of the general ledger where we at least need to turn it on at the configuration level or the setup level within the general ledger. Now, the other thing that is considered here is that, as you well know, there are multiple journals that we can set up in this system. There are some that are set up automatically for you when we have set up the Intacct system for you. As an example, the accounts payable module has a series of journals that were automatically created to accommodate or hold journal entries that come from the accounts payable system. If you have accounts receivable, the same is true. If you have the purchase order or the order entry system, the same is true. Now, the one thing that you will need to keep in mind here, and you will see this as we get into looking at the configuration screen, is that we select where we're going to dictate approvals to occur. We do that by journal. We either are going to have some journals that we will enter transactions into that will require approval, whereas there may be other journal types that are set up in the system that will not be required. And again, this is totally up to you as you're setting up that part of the system. Now, please understand this, is that a journal that is being used by a subledger, as it's referred to, or let's put it this way, another module, those entries, those GL entries that are posted to GL from that module do not go through an approval process, even though that you may select that journal as having to require an approval. So you're saying, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would I bother to identify, let's say, the accounts payable accrual transaction journal, even though that the accounts payable system is going to be posting to it, and it sounds to me like it is not going to require approval, even though that I may have identified it as one of the journals requiring that. You may have situations whereby individuals may post directly into those journals that you require for approval before that occurs, posting directly from the general ledger system. That's why there is an allowance for that. I'll make that point as we look at the configuration. Send email notifications. You either are going to send them or not. It contains a link, and it contains the name of the person, who submitted the transaction, and the date that was submitted. Journal transaction and description. Next section has to do with submitter can approve own journal entries. So this is what I was mentioning a little earlier, is that the question comes down to, in our example, is Carla Grace, who's an approver, can she approve her own transactions if she's entering in general ledger transactions? That's a decision that needs to be made by you, whether or not she will require to have her transactions approved. If we uncheck the box, then we can identify an alternate approver. Admin approver. So to have a backup of a person who serves as the ultimate approver, the one that can override general ledger transactions, this might be a person who you may identify as someone in the case that Carla may not be available or there's some delay for her to being able to get in and approve something. You've identified someone who is considered to be an admin approver that can go in and approve transactions. So we'll come back to the approver section, but let's go back out and visit with Intacct here and take a look at what those points are. So here we go, and we're going to move into the general ledger. We're going to go to Open Setup, and we're going to go to an area called Configure General Ledger. All right, and as we navigate down through the Setup option, we are looking for the Approval Option area. So the first checkbox would be to turn on the Enable Journal Entry Approvals. Without this box, no matter whether or not you have users that are set up to approve, you defined and satisfied all the requirements for setting up those users, but you haven't turned this box on, you will not be able to achieve any kind of approval for the general ledger transactions. Second question is to send email notification to approvals, and we check that box to making sure that if we are going to be using the email portion of the system, that we do want to have Carla Grace in this situation notified. And by the way, just as a side note, and just so that I don't miss it as we go along the way, is that Intacct, for those of you who have smartphones, Intacct is available for you. You may use Intacct over your smartphone, but where and more often than not is that people who are away from the office get email notifications can also open a link and get into Intacct to do approvals. So it's not necessary that they're sitting in front of a computer. They can be doing this also from the comfort of their smartphone or where they're at, so that at least the approval process can be moving along its way. So I wanted to mention that in case anyone had a question about that. And here we go. Submitter can approve their own entries. Now if I deselect that box, I want you to watch down here in the area that we're going to be coming to shortly here to talk about who the approvers are and who the the journals that we're going to require approval. If I uncheck that box, you'll notice how the alternate approver comes up and opens up for us to define, in this case, who the alternate person would be for Carla Grace should Carla enter in her own transactions. And then lastly here is that the admin approver is the ultimate one who has the keys to getting in and approving any journal entry, no matter what type of journal entry that has been put through the system and requiring approval. No email notification to that person, but at least a person who can enter in and go to that section called Approvals. Back to our document real quick here, and talking about approvers and some of the rules that we need to keep in mind for them is that the list of journals and approvals appear. You select Enable Journal Entry Approvers. We've done that. We now have to select the journal. As you recall, I was mentioning that, is that we do it by journal, and then identify the approver who's going to be approving and the alternate approver, okay, as to who that might be in case we want someone to approve journal entries entered in by approvers identified in the system. So let's go back and take a look at that real quick. And now we're down in the approver section. So if I open this up in this area, what you're going to see is a list of all the journals that have been set up in this part of the system. Now, these are journals either that were automatically created by Intacct when the system was first installed for you, or in some cases, this could be journals that you may have set up, or during our training we agreed to set up together that we're going to house certain types of journal entries. So in order for this part of the system to work appropriately, we have to identify all the journals that we want to make sure that go through an approval process. it could mean that not all journals that are being impacted with transactions must and be required to go through an approval. So as we go through and we identify, in this case, in the sample, we're identifying the general journal. This one I can fairly well safely say is automatically set up by the system. The payroll journal here generally is not something that gets automatically set up in the system because there's really not a payroll system that is native to Intacct. There are other ISV products that can be added to handle your payroll and integrate with the Intacct system should you decide to do this, but this was a journal that was hand set up by the user. Now you also notice out here to the right that we've identified Carla Grace as being the person who's going to approve. Okay, so they have to be able to, one, be identified through permissions to be an approver, and then we have to link the approver with the journal that is going to be used as that person who's going to be approving. Now, here's another trick that I discovered the other day in reading from notes from Intacct, is that if you need to have more than one approver on a particular journal, all you really need to do is identify the same journal again, but with a different approver. So in this case, we now have two approvers who are out there and assigned to go through an approval process. So I want to mention that. This encompasses the setup of the general ledger approval part of the system. So we'll want to make sure that that is in place, and I think about that as being the last place that we go to in terms of our overall setup before we're actually ready to go through and begin to watch the system work and begin through the approval process. So the other thing is that I wanted to mention here, there's things known as approval confirmations. And I did talk about the individual and the consolidated here. So I want to make sure that you don't overlook this, and this is part of something that was a question earlier here that dealt with this. But I would say if you really want to see this in action and you really get a good feeling of how the difference works between individual and consolidated, choose individual. Let it run for maybe a day or so, and then go in and change the configuration to consolidated, and then get a feel for that. It's not going to hurt the system. At least you'll have an opportunity to test both ways and then make some decisions as to each one will work. Last thing about confirmations is that Jacob, who is our person who's going to be entering in general journal transactions, will be sent an email once Carla goes through and either approves or declines, one or the other. He will also be notified and won't be left to guessing whether or not Carla has gone through and done her job in approving or disapproving certain transactions. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like to demonstrate this to you to show you how this works. So I do have a couple of tabs open here, and I have Carla Grace already in the system, but what I want to do is that I want to open up Jacob here and get him into the system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in as Jacob. Okay, so we're in as Jacob Coleman here. Jacob is now going to go in and enter in a journal entry. And now what he's going to do is going to identify the general journal. And now he's going to come down here and identify an account that he's going to put an entry into. And let's just say that's $12,000 worth of prepaid. Okay, and we're going to take that directly out of the cash account here. Now and we have a balanced entry here. All right. Now, one of the things I want you to notice is that if we didn't have the approval process turned on for the general journal, this button here would normally be viewed as a post button. But now, since we have the approval process turned on, it is now renamed as Submit. So we also have Submit New. So submitting means that Jacob is allowed to enter in the transaction, submit the transaction for approval, but he's not ultimately going to make that posting step until the transaction is finally approved. So we'll go ahead and hit submit here. Okay. Now, what I have done with both Carla and Jacob, just for the sake of being able to show how this emailing process from the Intacct works, is that I have both Jacob and Carla pointing to my email account. They're under different domains, but they are there just for the sake of us being able to look at this. So in my inbox here, I have an entry that came from Intacct. This is Carla Grace, okay? Dear Carla Grace, a journal entry has been submitted for your review and approval. The requester is Jacob Coleman. It was submitted on the 23rd of February from the General Journal, transaction or GL entry 226, monthly adjustment. So what the question is here is that would you please review, either approve or either decline the entry that is here. Here is the link that allows Carla to get back in. So if I didn't have Carla already logged in, we would go through a login process. And regardless of whether or not you're working off of your computer or either off of a smartphone, you still have to follow a login process. So I'm going to click here, and this is going to take me directly into that area of the general ledger that will allow me to see all of the journal entries that are ready for me to go through and make a decision on to either approve or decline. And you can see the one that was just entered in here is now here and available. I have the ability to view it. I have the ability to either approve or decline. Okay? I do have a mass decline, which would allow me to, or a mass approve. If I choose the checkbox here at the top of the list, and assuming that I have multiple entries here, I can make one fell swoop approval or either decline. But more often than not, most of these entries should be looked at and then made some kind of decision off of. So I simply just drilled down on this, allowing me to view the entry that Jacob has entered. You can see here's the transaction number, here's the date of the transaction. You can see that the status of the transaction is in a submitted state. I have the ability of being able to look at the accounts that are being distributed to and the locations. Now, I also have the ability to edit these transactions. And the reason why editing is permissible here is because we've allowed Carla through the permissions to being able to edit general ledger entries. So this is one of the reasons that would support her having editing capabilities, so that perhaps that she could correct them without necessarily having to go through an approval process again. What she's looking at here is something that she is also going to approve. We'll go ahead and have Jacob put in another transaction, and we'll walk through the decline so that you can see how that works. So I'm going to go ahead, and Carla says this one's good. By the way, there's a history tab out here that will give you a listing on date and time and the actions that occurred on this particular transaction entry. So from the time that it was entered to the time that it was submitted to the time that it was approved, all of that is being recorded here so that you can look back in the event you need to find out more information about certain transactions, how they were entered, and who was involved in the approval process. So let's go ahead and we're going to head and approve here. And now that particular transaction now has been approved, and the area that Carla was sent to upon her clicking the link was here at the general ledger level under approved journal entries. So if we go out here to journal entry here, okay, and we look at the general journal, we should find 226, and it's now in a posted status. However, let's go out and take a look at the email, and Jacob did get an email, and he's now finding that the journal entry 226 has been submitted and approved. Okay, and if he wanted to look and view the entry, here you can see that here's that entry. Here are the accounts that were distributed to and the amounts and the history behind that. And it has also now been posted upon approval. So let's look at this in a slightly different fashion. and test out what it might mean if Jacob was entering in an entry that Carla found that she needed to decline. So we'll have him enter in another transaction here. Okay. Again, we're going to choose the general journal in this case just because it's a little easier. And we're going to just say this is an annual transaction. Come down here to an account, and let's just say that we're going to record some depreciation as an example. And let's just say we have about $30,000 we're going to account for here. And I'm going to look for the accumulated depreciation account. Let's just say that that was computer equipment, and I need to identify the location in this case. Perhaps on the depreciation side of things, some of the other dimensions that you may be using would identify it along the way, but again, for ease of entry, this is what I'm entering. All right, so now what we're going to do, Jacob is now entering this transaction with good faith, and he is submitting this transaction, and it looks like department dimension is required on this particular account, so I'm going to go back and identify a department here, and I'm just going to call that administrative. So just a step that was missed during the entry, so Intacct caught it, followed the rule, and now it's allowed Jacob to submit that transaction. Now, if we go back to the email here, we should find now that Carla has been notified that another journal entry has been entered in. Jacob has requested, here's the date, transaction number 227, and the request is for Carla to go back in and view the transaction and make some decisions as to whether or not she's going to approve or decline or possibly change the transaction. So we'll click, and now we're back in as Carla. Again, it took Carla to this specific area. Notice the approved journal entries. So she's going to go in and take a look at this and find out that, well, wait a minute here. No, we're not ready to record depreciation. In fact, we haven't even accounted for and come up with the true value for our computer equipment. I cannot allow this transaction to go through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decline. Carla's declining that transaction. Now, the one thing that I did miss here that I was intending for it to flag and come up was a little note that could be attached here with that transaction that would be available for Jacob to get a better understanding of why Carla dismissed and did not approve that transaction. I'm sorry I missed that step and didn't get to the flag soon enough to put in a note there that Carla needed to convey there. But it is available out there to being able to use and make sure that communication is widely understood as to what happened and why that transaction was not approved. But if we go back out, here's Jacob. Okay, he's finding out now the person has declined the entry, and if he goes back in to view the journal entry, here the entry is. He has the ability to go in and edit. He also had, I believe, the ability to being able to delete the entry and then perhaps re-enter that transaction in a more appropriate time. We covered how to go about setting up the approval process. We have covered some of the more important aspects having to do with the type of user, the preferences that we have to pay particular attention to when it comes to whether or not we're emailing, the consolidation or individual emails, whether or not that person is an approver, and then on to permissions. Permissions, regardless of whether or not they're individual permissions or role-based permissions, those permissions need to be set accordingly. And then finally, the configuration within the general ledger system that really sets up the remaining nuts and bolts, if you will, of how the approval process is going to work within the general ledger system within Intacct. And then finally, just simply making sure that you identify the journals. Most importantly, that you're going to want to make sure that there is an approval process against those journals. And secondly, who will be the person out of all your approvers that are going to be approving on a per journal basis. And then finally, whether or not the approvers will also face the scrutiny of other approvers to approve their individual entries as well. A bit of a recap on that. Now, one of the things that we have learned is that Intacct is very aggressive about this approval process system throughout the Intacct system, and that they are continually considering making improvements to it. In fact, the purchase order system in the last quarterly update received some changes to its approval system that were really great, much needed in many ways. You can surely see some of Intacct's commitment to making sure that when it comes to this kind of thing, because it has become more important as we get further into security and wanting to automate a lot of our processes in the system to using approvals within the Intacct system. Well, I want to thank you all for attending. I hope this was helpful. We certainly like to hear back from you, especially if this was helpful for you, and whether or not you have any other questions. We're certainly ready, willing, and able to help you through, even to the extent if you need some help setting this part of the system up for approvals, we'd be happy to help you out. So we really appreciate having you as Intacct clients, and we want to make sure that we serve you well. So thanks a lot for attending, and you all have a great day.